Hey, good afternoon. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. Today, I'm very thrilled and excited to have with me as my guest Mike Trigg, who's an angel investor, a Silicon Valley tech executive, and now author of his first book called BitFlip. Mike, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Richard. Really excited to be here.
Well, Mike, let me start by asking you a very simple question. What possessed you to even do something? I mean, what possesses an author to try something like this? Or let's start with something very basic.
I like to say that I went from an occupation with incredibly low odds of success in starting companies to one with even lower odds of success in writing a book. No, it's honestly something that I've kind of always wanted to do. I was a history major in undergrad at Northwestern University and took a creative writing class, and it was sort of the first time for me that it sparked of like, oh, I actually really enjoy this. But I kind of chickened out. I felt like, I don't know if I can make a living being an author. And I pursued a career in sort of writing adjacent things. I worked on Capitol Hill. I got into public relations. Did some marketing, did occupations where I wrote for a living, but kind of more in a business setting. And then kind of early 90s, mid 90s, this thing came along called the information superhighway. I was pretty intrigued by that and decided to kind of pursue the tech industry. I saw it as, and obviously this has proven to be true, sort of a once in a generation transformation. So I went to business school at UC Berkeley. Haas Business School, and spent the next 20 plus years in varying tech companies, from big 30, 40,000 person companies down to embryonic startups that I founded myself. And then it was really during COVID that I decided to take the plunge into writing. I'd been kind of dabbling with the idea of writing a book. I read a lot of nonfiction books about Silicon Valley, and there are a lot of nonfiction books about Silicon Valley, a lot of media coverage of Silicon Valley, but there weren't very many novels about Silicon Valley that I thought kind of accurately portrayed this world. And I thought that's what I wanted to, that's what I want to capture, kind of an authentic insider's view of this moment in time and this unique culture and place. So I set out to write it, and was doing it on nights and weekends as I was working on yet another startup. And during COVID, we weren't able to raise a round for that business. We were just 3 or 4 people. So decided to wind it down. And I thought, if I'm ever going to take the plunge into writing full time, now's the time to do it. I'm not walking away from the salary or anything. So I jumped in and, found a publisher. Book came out in mid-August of 22. And I'm working on the second one right now.
So tell me, before you wrote this book, had you written even short stories? Or, I mean, you talked about I assume you wrote some stuff in college, but have you tried even writing like some short stories or novelettes or anything like that?
No, I didn't really. I probably shouldn't say this, but I don't really read a lot of short stories. I like full-length novels as the format, and I love nonfiction, especially narrative nonfiction. There've been some great ones, like Bad Blood by John Carreyrou is about blanking on the name of the company all of a sudden, but
Enron. There's the great story Enron.
Yeah. I mean, there's just some great nonfiction out there, and so. But I was a very prolific sort of blogger. So I love writing columns. I contributed posts to, TechCrunch and Entrepreneur magazine and stuff, kind of in my professional capacity, sometimes with an ulterior motive of trying to push a point of view or something for the product or company that I was at. But I like to write, and I like to be part of the conversation. I like to analyze kind of what's going on. Maybe another career path for me might have been a journalist. I do enjoy sharing those kind of opinions and perspectives about what's going on in the business landscape. And so it was a pretty natural, even though the book's obviously fiction, it's a novel, but it felt very comfortable to write. It was a relatable world. I sort of wrote what I knew, wrote something that was based in part on my experiences in Silicon Valley. And so, it came almost too easily. I ended up writing, I think it was, 450 pages in the first draft of this thing. It was just way too long. And so for me, the process was really one of pruning it back and making sure that the structure was right to make it a compelling story.
Now, tell me, is the character, the main character, the protagonist? Is that you? Is it based on you and a few other characters? Who's it kind of based on?
Yeah, that, as you can imagine, is a question I get a lot because it's not. There's certainly some similarities between me and Sam Hughes, the protagonist. He's also a Midwestern transplant. He's also a C-level executive at a startup. But I really realized early on that I wasn't trying to write, a memoir or a tell-all tale about, some company that I'd been at. I joke that, I'm not sure that would have been as interesting as writing a purely fictional story. So I really leaned into the fiction aspect of it and got a lot of, that was where my creative juices really ran wild. There's certainly, a lot of little anecdotes that I did experience myself, and whether they're quotes or one-liners or just experiences or people that I've met along the way, but genuinely, as it's disclaimed in the front of the book, these are kind of composite characters. I really wanted people who felt believable and credible for people who've spent their career in Silicon Valley. But I also wanted the story to be accessible to anybody, regardless of whether they're in the tech industry or not. And I think I achieved a pretty good balance of that. It doesn't feel too inside baseball to somebody not from the tech industry, but it also, I think, for people in the tech industry, people are like, wow, this is like PTSD. Like, this is really close to home, very, very credible tale. So
now, I'm not being an author myself. I'm always curious to know about what I perceive to be sort of a chicken and egg problem, which is the following, and I'd love your view on this. Do you decide to write a book and then you come up with an idea, or do you come up with an idea and then you write the book?
That's a great question.
And which way did it happen for you?
I think I would say I had the idea to write the book, and I would sort of admit in hindsight that I came up with the name of the book, BitFlip, pretty early.
Before you even had
before I even had the story. Yeah, that is, as you know, a bit when it switches from 0 to 1.
Yeah.
That is in technical terms a bit flip, but I'm using it here sort of metaphorically to mean a change of heart, basically. And I felt like I was going through a little bit of a change of heart about what I wanted to do in my career and about the tech industry in general. And so pretty early on, it was like, that's what I want the story to be. And I would capture, I often credit my wife with this. I'd get home, as one does, and we'd talk over the dinner table, how was your day, kind of conversations. And I'd share something, a little anecdote or story or quip that happened. And she would sort of have this refrain of like, you should write a book. You should write a book. This is kind of interesting. It's funny. You have a good way of telling stories like this. And so it kind of started as like, I wanted to do this change of heart thing. And I had a bunch of little anecdotal things. But I just didn't have a way of tying those vignettes into something really coherent, a full-fledged story. And where I borrowed inspiration and then, of course, promptly deviated from it substantially. But there's a narrative outline called The Hero's Journey that a lot of people are familiar with. You see it everywhere, from Star Wars and The Hobbit to everything in between. And when I kind of grabbed onto that, I was like, okay, this is giving me a good framework to kind of put these little vignettes into and tell a story here. And of course, as I said, I departed from it in many ways. Instead of a mentor, I had sort of an anti-mentor. But that was really helpful for me as a first-time author to kind of weave it into something that I feel really proud about.
Quickly describe, what is the hero's journey? I mean, I have an idea what it is, but tell me what is the hero's journey?
Yeah. So the basic premise is that, the hero, the protagonist, is sort of cast out of their regular world, right? Luke Skywalker leaves his planet or whatever, and the Hobbit leaves his shire, and it's oftentimes somewhat kind of against their will in the beginning. And they need to sort of figure out the path, figure out on this journey how to make things right again, how to basically return home. It often involves, a mentor character, Yoda in Star Wars, to name something relatable to everybody. It often involves what's described as an elixir, something that sort of is going to make things right, a ring or whatever. And then, ultimately vindication, validation, et cetera, when they return to their homeland, if you will, or achieve their quest. And so that's the broad strokes of it. And for me, in my book, I described it as sort of a corporate thriller. It's a little bit in the vein of like a John Grisham, The Firm, kind of those corporate legal thrillers of the early 90s, which I loved growing up. And but I didn't want to have it be too much of a thriller. I didn't feel like people wielding knives and getting murdered and whatnot was just sort of didn't feel plausible, right? That doesn't really happen in Silicon Valley startups. And so I picked a scenario to cast Sam, the protagonist, out of his regular world in something that people often list as one of their biggest fears, which is public speaking. So he is thrust onto stage. His impetuous, younger founder CEO decides he can't be bothered to speak at this big event. And so Sam is dropped into it and ends up kind of going off the rails and melting down a little bit. And I thought, okay, that's a really fun way. He ends up getting fired as a result. And that is him getting cast out of his regular world, getting kind of thrown off his axis.
Well, what would you say the hardest thing about writing this book was? I mean, was it coming up with the story? Was it the actual writing? Was it the dialogue? I hear dialogue is very hard to write. I mean, tell me some of the granular things that really you struggled with as you wrote this book.
Yeah. Well, I actually dialogue. I love writing dialogue. It's one of the reasons it sort of comes to me naturally. I think the hardest thing was really, as I touched on, kind of the editing part of it. I overwrote it at first, right? And some of that was, I was a history major, as I mentioned, and I'm kind of a Silicon Valley history buff a little bit. And, so for example, I had this whole prologue in the original draft of a family that had lived in the same house as Sam and his family, like moved in there in the 1950s, and sort of say how much Silicon Valley has changed from sort of orchards to this burgeoning tech community in a relatively short period of time. And the editor that I worked with, he's like, "This is great, but like, what does it have to do with the story? Like, just like are those ghosts that are going to reappear in their house or something? Like, it's really kind of dangling off the end." So I had to let go of a number of chapters that were fun for me to write, and I thought they were kind of interesting, but they ultimately just didn't do anything to carry the plot forward. And so that is really helpful. Again, as a first-time author, you kind of, well, as any author, any writer, you sort of think everything you write is interesting, and it's really helpful to have that editor be the counterbalance and really help you prioritize, help you structure it in a way that keeps the reader engaged. So that was probably the hardest part for me.
Well, you said you obviously you read a lot of nonfiction. This is yet a work of fiction. Is there a certain genre of fiction that you sort of modeled after, or that you sort of took? What would you say?
Yeah, a little bit. First of all, I now read a ton of fiction. I have had a goal the last couple of years to read a book a week, so 52 books in a year, and strictly novels. That's not including the nonfiction that I read. But I didn't find a lot in the fiction aisle about Silicon Valley. The books that I probably cite most frequently are Dave Eggers, who's also a Bay Area author, wrote 2 novels kind of on big tech companies, one called The Circle and one called more recently called The Every, that, are meant to be critiques of big tech and things like that. Dave is an incredible writer, but, didn't spend his career in the tech industry. So to me, as a tech insider, the books read a little, they don't read quite authentically. I don't read them and say, oh, I can relate to that. That feels like, really relevant to my experience. So there've been a few like that are really good books and very entertaining. The Circle was made into a movie, but, weren't quite what I was looking for. I think with my second book, I'm leaning a little bit more into, it still examines sort of the impact of technology on our lives, but it's not set within a corporate setting. So it leans a little bit more into sort of the psychological thriller. So you see, that's a very popular genre today. with, books like Gone Girl and, The Last Thing You Told Me by Laura Dave is set in the Bay Area up in Sausalito. So books like that were kind of reference points for me. And then, we touched on it. I mean, Scott Turow and John Grisham and sort of the early corporate and legal thrillers, really those guys invented that whole idea that the workplace could be dramatic and interesting.
Right.
And so I think there's definitely, Joseph Finder is another one that wrote a couple. Paranoia was based on a tech company. So there's that, is a little bit now, those books are going back 20, 30 years, but that is another kind of literary milieu that I kind of mined for reference points or comparables.
What's the feedback been?
It's been great. Yeah, it's been great. I have been doing a series of events. I've been doing a lot of interviews, several podcasts. I was on local TV, did a feature piece in the San Francisco Chronicle. So it's been great to talk to folks in the media, but the events have been really, really gratifying. I've done a bunch of these. I did one at Book Sync in Palo Alto, one at Book Passage in San Francisco in the Ferry Building. I've done, 3 other in the Bay Area at Barnes & Noble and others. I've done Ohio, I've done Seattle, I've done New York, I have Chicago coming up. And they're just really, for me, it sort of highlights why I wrote the book in the first place, which is, I'm not trying to make money off this book. I'm fairly certain I won't make money off this book. It's really about impacting the discussion and the dialogue and being thought-provoking, being a sort of cultural critique. That's the power of literature, is to put people into, a scenario and face decisions and sort of think about how they would handle things. And so, whether it's these events where people ask questions, or I'm engaging with a couple book clubs who selected the book as their, book of the month to read, put together discussion guides on it. I was like, yes, like that's exactly what I wanted to provoke with this book is a conversation. And so the chance to be involved in those has been really fun for me.
Well, interesting. So was there anything major in the book or an idea that was rejected? Was there anything in particular they had to throw? You talked about certain passages, but was there any major story themes that you ended up just tossing that didn't end up making to the book? Or
well, I'll answer this and hopefully entice people to read it. The book went through sort of a brain surgery as I started working with my editor. The passage that I described where Sam kind of has this truth-saying moment of clarity on stage happened towards the ending rather than the beginning. And so, Sam's bit flip moment kind of is in the beginning in the final version. And it really changed everything else about the book, the progression, his character evolution, etc. And where I wanted to place him was sort of in having this sort of idealism early on. And then he gets kind of pulled back into the company that he gets fired from, suspecting potential fraud. So there's a little bit of him that has this, sense of fiduciary responsibility as an executive. Part of him wants to get revenge against the founder who ousted him. Part of him wants validation for his whole, career choices and his lifetime goal to be successful in Silicon Valley. And so it really puts the reader, I think, into a position that a lot of us have experienced in our careers in Silicon Valley. This is a place of smart, ambitious people, and we all want to be successful. And the incentives in Silicon Valley startups can sometimes pull you in a lot of different directions. And so I had to put it into a realistic scenario where people could kind of envision that slippery slope happening to them and sort of like, well, what would I do? What would I do? What would I do? There's a lot of gray areas in the book and in one's career here, leading right up to the end. You're not sure what Sam's going to do. So that was really fun to write that stuff and include that stuff. And it forced, to the core of your question, like what changed. I'm a Midwesterner. I think of myself as a good guy. I kind of wanted Sam to be a good guy, but I realized as I wrote it, it was going to be a little bit more interesting if Sam was more complicated, right? If Sam was a little more unreliable, a little more unpredictable, does some things in the book where you go, ooh, I'm not sure, I'm not sure about that decision. And that made him a lot more, I think, interesting character. He wasn't, the book came across as less, pedantic and more realistic, maybe.
What is the most interesting or surprising feedback you've gotten?
Well, a lot of people have given feedback on the ending. I won't give that away because, but that has provoked a lot of conversation with people who've read the full book of like, well, why did you end it that way? And I didn't see that coming. And those sorts of comments, which is great. The other thing that I wouldn't say I didn't expect it, but I think the humor in the book has really resonated with people. And I didn't set out to write a satire. I don't really think of it that way. But sort of throughout the book, it's written in third person, but mostly through Sam's perspective. And so you get little quips and sarcastic remarks that he makes in his head. And I think a lot of people, it's like, yeah, that's kind of what's going through my head when I'm at a cocktail mixer or I'm in a board meeting or, at a social event or whatever it is, that there's a little bit of, Silicon Valley, like any environment, Hollywood, Wall Street, Washington, D.C., that attracts smart, ambitious people. There's a little bit of theater that goes on in all those things. There's a little bit of one-upmanship that goes on. There's a little bit of social posturing and positioning that tends to go on. And I wanted to acknowledge those things, not through what Sam says or does, but through kind of the thoughts running through his head. So I think a lot of people have really said, gosh, the book was, funnier than I expected, even though at its heart, it's, again, it's kind of a cultural critique and a corporate thriller.
Movie?
So it's a little hard to classify. Movie. I would love to have it.
Netflix? Will there be a Netflix
exactly.
movie? I mean,
anybody from Netflix is tuned in. You know where to find me. I've never been a filmmaker, but I am a pretty visual person. I'm a marketing guy, and so a lot of the scenes in the book
could be.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of
did you write it? Did you write it with that intent, or that's not what you were?
No, but. Also, I think another reason for that is it's set here in the Bay Area, and I chose, even though it's a critique of tech culture, it's also a love story to the Bay Area. When I came out here in '96, I was like, I am never leaving. This is Nirvana, right? I mean, from the weather to the culture to the environment, everything. And so I picked a lot of real world places where I had done things like Bucks and Woodside or Cafe Baroni or, the Fairmont Hotel or whatever it might be. And I've gotten a little my amateur filmmaker on because I decided to, as a way of promoting the book, to shoot a series of short, 1 to 2 minute videos where I do this sort of virtual book tour where I go around to different real world locations that serve as scenes in the book. And that's been a ton of fun. It's been a disproportionate investment of my time. But I have a new appreciation for editors of video, but it's been super fun. And I think that's where the visual element, does lend itself. A lot of people have said this could be a film, this could be a TV series, because, like the show Silicon Valley on HBO, there's real places that when you see them, you're like, oh yeah, I can. It suddenly just informs that scene, right? You know exactly where that person's sitting, you know exactly what they're experiencing. And I wanted to film some of that to sort of bring the story to life.
Oh, very cool. Now, the second book is not a sequel then? It's not the same character? No. Okay, it's something totally different, or?
Yeah, totally different. My lane as an author is examining the impact of technology on contemporary life. Like the first one was sort of set within a tech company. This one's not set within a tech company. It's two younger protagonists, but it very much deals with, how social media is impacting our lives, disinformation, online movements, and just some of the things that have really we've all become more aware of in the last few years, particularly as around politics and how tech and politics are kind of getting intertangled here.
Right.
I mentioned I worked on Capitol Hill for a while, so I have a little bit of a political bent. So there's a little bit more of that in this second novel. The working title is called Burner, as in a burner phone. I'm super excited about it. I think it's a really interesting story. I think it too will provoke a lot of dialogue and debate over the kinds of things that I want to be critical of, but a little bit more of a true kind of thriller genre, if you will.
Well, Mike, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your taking the time and telling about it. And congratulations on all your
Thank
success.
You.
And when that second book does come out, you'll please come back and tell me about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Richard, for having me on. And I'll definitely be happy to come back when that second book comes out.
This is Richard Hsu and Mike Trigg. Thanks.